Before viewing video lessons, it is important to read the textbook using the learning guide as your turn-by-turn directions. Then use the learning guide to take organized notes in your own words with examples and pictures. This is a continuation video on Chapter 11, Personality Disorders. So there's a couple of different views of personality, and we're going to look at each one of those views in turn. So the primary question is going to be, is a personality disorder just an extreme version of a normal trait, or is it something distinctively different? That's a personality that doesn't really exist in normality in any way, shape, or form. It's something other than normal personality. So the version of this that says that personality disorders are something other, distinctively different, is called categorical. And the view on personality disorders that says that they are just extreme variations of normal is called dimensional. So the categorical model is the traditional model we've used for psychological personality disorders. It's also the model that is used in the current DSM-5 as the primary model for diagnosing the psychological disorders. And the complaint about this categorical model is that the categories that are created under this system are sort of these artificial all or nothing categories where you're either completely and totally very different from everybody else or you don't have a problem. The other issue with these categories is that if they are completely and totally different from everything else, then the categories should be very distinctive from anything else to include one another. However, the current model has many criteria that overlap and apply to multiple diagnoses. And so there's been some problems identified with this categorical model. The personality disorder model that is the dimensional model takes a little bit of a different approach to this. And what they say is that personality traits exist on a continuum. And this is true for all the different disorders that we have. So you can think about an anxiety disorder where there's kind of normal levels of anxiety and extreme levels of anxiety. Or a mood disorder where there's kind of normal bad days and periods of sadness, and there's sort of abnormal, pathological, dysfunctional days of depression. So they look at this same model when they look at personality. And they say that there are only a set number of personality traits, such as the Big Five, and that people exist on a continuum. Some are high, some are low, and that disorders tend to represent people who have the most extreme version of these otherwise normal traits, and include this idea that those extremes are very rigid and inflexible. The dimensional model also recognizes the importance of considering culture and cultural norms in assessment. So what we definitely don't want to do is pathologize someone for being from a different culture. So if they're behaving in a culturally appropriate way, then that's a culturally appropriate way, and we're not going to label that as a disorder just because they're different. So the categorical model has been the traditional model that we've had since we've had the DSM as a diagnostic system, and it is still the model that is dominated in the current DSM-5. But there was a lot of controversy when this version was updated in May of 2013. And so there's actually a separate chapter. It's in the back of your DSM if you have one. And this separate chapter uses this alternate model. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of it. It's possible that this could become dominant in the future or not. So the alternate model of personality that's based on the dimensional model says that a personality disorder has an impairment of personality functioning, and there is a particular pathological personality trait. So the types of personality traits that are identified in the DSM-5 are negative affectivity, so the tendency to experience and emote a lot of negative emotions. That might be somewhat similar to extreme neuroticism in the Big Five. And that trait can be contrasted with somebody who has emotional stability. Another pathological personality trait is detachment. So being detached from others and not really being a part of a social network and a social world. And that would be contrasted with a healthy sense of extroversion or interest in others. The next pathological personality trait is antagonism, or this tendency to be very disagreeable and kind of start arguments. Somebody might call somebody like this somebody who's looking for a fight or always trying to pick a fight. And we can contrast that with the concept of agreeableness, which is also a trait that you notice in the Big Five personality. Disinhibition is a pathological personality trait in which somebody has little control over their impulses. They tend to be one of those people that will try anything and do anything, which can be very disruptive. It sometimes results in disrespecting the rights of others. And we can contrast that with somebody who's conscientious, which was one of those Big Five traits that we just talked about, where they're very cognizant of rules and regulations and doing the right thing. So those first four, you can see how they are tied somewhat to Big Five personality traits. The last one's a little bit different. It's called psychoticism, or this tendency to view the world from a perspective that's not consistent with reality all the time, to have a very different view of the world that is inconsistent with others' views. And that's contrasted with the concept of lucidity or being lucid. So if somebody's lucid, they tend to be really in touch with reality. So for a dimensional disorder, they would have one of these personality traits and could have more than one disordered trait. And so we would identify the trait, and then that trait would be causing some sort of impairment in functioning. So the impairment in functioning could be focused on the individual or the self. And so it could be interfering with their self-identity or their self-direction, their ability to sort of direct their own lives in a functional way. You can also have an impairment that is interpersonal, so an impairment related to other people. And so that could result in a lack of empathy for others or difficulty with intimate, close relationships with others. So that model can be contrasted with the current model, which is the traditional model of personality disorders. In this model, there are 10 specific personality disorders organized into 3 clusters. So the clusters have some shared characteristics as a cluster, but then within each cluster, the individual disorders will be thought to be distinctive categories of personality. So the first cluster is cluster A, and those are personalities that have some sort of odd or eccentric behavior or thoughts. Cluster B, the disorders all have sort of a shared emotionality, erratic, dramatic type of behavior. And then cluster C are disorders that share like a core fearfulness or anxiousness in views of the world. So we were going to be going over each of those clusters in separate videos